the Mayans we discovered might actually have ended up in Georgia, like the United States, where Trump just got arrested in Georgia. Because there's always that big question of like, where did the Mayans go after the civilization collapse? Did they disappear?
History surprise bonus
the surprise
round?
history bonus round news.
Surprise history breaking bonus round news. Go. So the Mayans.
So where do you think they went? Right? What happened to the Mayan civilization?
So do you think they went somewhere or they died?
That's the question, right? Okay. But it makes sense to me. I'm like, why would we think that they all just vanished or died off or whatever? They probably just migrated and joined other groups. Doesn't that make sense? That's what most civilizations would do when they collapse.
So wait, people still have Mayan. They're still Mayan people.
There still are Mayan people. So that's why I also think it's really silly. So after the Mayan civilization collapsed, then you have the Neo-Mayans. And that's who the Spanish encountered. And that's who they went to war with and gave their diseases to. And a lot of them died off. But there was still Mayans to this day. You can go to Mexico and Honduras and other places, and there's still Mayans there. They speak Mayan and live in little Mayan villages and stuff.
Didn't they speak Mayan in that movie I showed you, Apocalypto?
Uh-huh.
Right.
And they were speaking Mayan in Black Panther, the newest one.
The Titlan.
That thing. Yep.
Okay. The serpent, the winged serpent.
Because I told you, I went to Tulum, where they are at there. They called it Zama, but it was Tulum today is what we call it. So I got to actually see that site, and I didn't get to tour the village. My parents did though, and I guess some of the people that were on this like cruise tour were like, "Oh my god, how cute!" Like they actually like wear costumes and they have their little like clothes on stuff. It's so realistic. My mom's like, "You're dumb. Like this is literally how they live. We're just touring their literal house. This isn't a set, guys.
It ain't a fucking costume."
Yeah, I know. Like this is how they live.
Where was this? What country?
So the Mayans
Peru?
were like kind of primarily like in Mexico, but like Mexico, Belize, Honduras.
Way up there.
So
Mexico.
Their civilization kind of sort of collapsed. And then, like I said, eventually you have like the Neo-Mayans kind of revive and bring it back. But where did they get their Mayan blue? Because that's what they're really known for is this blue. And it's not really present in Mexico.
Blue what?
Like a blue color.
For pigment?
Yeah, for like painting, drawing. Because they had written language too, right? A lot of people don't give them credit for that, but they wrote stuff. Anyway, so they had blue
hieroglyphics,
and they do paintings, and they do their little written word, and it was pictographic. So they're even when they're writing, it's like pictures. So they liked color to kind of like fill in a lot of stuff, whether it's writing or pictures. So they had a blue. The blue is significant because it's not really present in Mexico, Belize, Honduras, anywhere. There might be like a site or two, but it's like there's not even enough blue to really provide for this whole Mayan empire. So where are they getting the blue?
From what I understand about blue and violet, it's hard to find on Earth.
Yeah, it doesn't really occur much naturally.
Right.
So what they did find though is that blue pigment. They can tell where it comes from. I don't know if it's a rock, a mineral, whatever it is. But they found it in Georgia, in the United States South. But also they've now found rocks and stuff that have carvings that are very similar with the Mayans were drawing on stuff. Not any of the written language, but like swirls and stuff like that and indentations in rocks right around the areas where there's that blue that somehow ended up in Mexico. So they're thinking they might have had a trade network, or there might have been Mayans there in Georgia that were transporting it down through Mexico to get them the blue. Or even after they collapsed, they're thinking maybe a lot of Mayans went up there and join their civilization. Now, here's the interesting part about that. The civilizations that were over there, we start getting the Mississippian culture, also known as the mound builders. The mound builders were the ones I told you about. They built those big-ass archaeological sites. They knew exactly where the sun, the moon, all the astrological stuff was going on, and they had it all oriented with astrology, which we know the Mayans did. But the mound builders were suddenly rising right about the time that the Mayans were falling. So it's like the Mayan civilization collapsed, maybe, I'm just saying possibly, went up to Georgia and then started teaching this Mississippian culture that was developing. Like, hey, if you kind of do this or that, we can kind of do stuff. So granted, I did bring up to my mom, I was like,
so then
why didn't they build with rock? Like they clearly knew how to build with stones and they had tools and stuff. But my mom was even thinking, maybe they didn't take over the culture. Maybe they just influenced them. Maybe they kind of went in there and were like, hey, this is what we were doing down in Mexico. Maybe you guys should try some of this stuff out and just kind of let them do their thing. You know, maybe just kind of sat back and just gave them some ideas. I don't know.
I don't think there is a lot of stone to work with in the plains.
That is true.
In the Mississippi Valley.
That was something I thought about too. If you had a big enough network, though, which they did, you could transport it. Because we know the Mississippians had like shells from the West Coast and they had rocks from like New York. So they had a big trade network, but I'm not saying that they cared enough. Maybe they didn't care enough to move the rocks.
It was because probably personal items, not like dirt. Large
just
scale.
Trading and stuff.
Yeah.
But they did build these massive mounds, and when the Europeans finally arrived, they saw them and they thought giants had built it because clearly Native Americans were too inferior to have built anything. So it took archaeologists in modern day, when they were literally building a highway, they were like, I guess we can't build a highway here because there's like a potential archaeological site right here, and that's when they finally investigated it. Was more recent in history. And they were like, like the Native Americans built this and discovered a bunch of stuff about them.
So then what's the conclusion of this? Where did the Mayans go?
I think they just went everywhere. I think some of them went into other parts of Mexico or further into Central America. I think some of them may have even gone up to the southern United States.
And what year is this?
When they collapsed, I want to say it was like...
Timeline.
I think like 1100 or 1200s AD.
Oh,
I think somewhere around there,
even that long ago.
Which is about when the Mississippians were coming into a rise. Well, they were around for a while. The Mayan civilization was around for a couple hundred years, and then they collapsed.
No, I'm sure they were.
And then they came back, and then they were there all the way up until the Spaniards show up and literally wipe them out with disease and guns.
But weren't they already a lot weaker by the time the Spanish got here? Like they weren't at their peak?
No, because I think their peak would have been during their former civilization, not the like Neo-Mayan.
That's what I mean. So the peak was in the past.
That would have probably been around, like 100s, maybe 1100s, 80, somewhere in there.
So were Neo-Mayans traveling, or did they get killed?
Traveling? What do you mean?
So I'm sorry, I was getting lost. So I was making two groups like Mayans and Neo-Mayans.
Well, I mean, in a sense, they are sort of the same thing, but they're also sort of not. Just in the sense,
just depends on who's there at what time.
Historians love to give things terms because it makes it easier to kind of comprehend things. For example, like what's the difference between the Visigoths and the Ostrogoths? One means Western Goths, one means Eastern Goths. It's just where they ended up. It actually has nothing to do with a lot of significance. We just like labeling things. So I wouldn't say that the Mayans and the Neo-Mayans are different per se. It's just like, think if the United States collapsed and then we came back, we would call us like the Neo-Americans instead of like the Americans. It's just to distinguish periods of history in a sense.
So then, so during it was like around 1200s, you're saying they probably went to Georgia?
Yeah. And then I'm not giving exact timelines here, but I think they collapsed for about 100 years and came back. So it was a couple generations, at least a generation or two, if not like 3 or 4, before they finally came back with a new civilization.
Did they spread out and travel because of the collapse, do you think?
I think so. Like I would say
the cities and the governments fell.
And we do know why they collapsed.
We're nomads.
They collapsed because they were running out of wood. There was a drought. They weren't able to keep producing enough food. Well, there was corruption and stuff like that. The gold wasn't such an issue.
Or whatever. Yeah.
They had too much population because as you get more food, more water, more resources, you're able to grow, populate, and then you experience a couple hard years of famine or drought or whatever, or lack of building materials. The next thing you know, you're like, ooh, can't support this population. And then your civilization collapses. So that's kind of what happened with them.
Interesting.
But to assume that they all died just doesn't make sense. I'm sure they just joined other tribes or whatever, and then some might have.
From what I remember from school, it was just disease in Spanish,
and that would be the Neo-Mayans.
So that did a lot, right?
So that but that would be the Neo-Mayans then, because obviously this civilization collapsed and then came back. Even so they weren't the Spanish came.
Pandemics within themselves much, right?
Well, they might have, but it doesn't look like that's what was happening, because we could find that in remains. We have like forensic anthropologists and archaeologists that could look at it and see if they did, and we haven't really found anything to support that. That's something we would find after the Spanish arrived.
So-
Next thing you know, like everyone's dying of diseases.
Shit got fucked, and then they hit the road, but then it picked up again.
And they were doing good. Yeah.
So then maybe the one
So they had almost like a second golden age in a sense. It wasn't like the golden age. That would have been the former Mayans, but this new Neo just means new Mayan civilization. They had like a second rebound, like a second little period. When the Spanish showed up, they were kind of at their height. The Neo-Mayan civilization was at its height. You know, it might not have fully gotten back to where the former Mayans had been, but like they were doing pretty good for their period of history. Like they were doing really good. And the next thing they know, these weird people that had facial hair showed up on.
So
horses.
it was like a devastation to the Neo-Mayan.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. I think there was only a couple of Mayan, I don't know, kingdoms by that point because they were kind of separate kingdoms. But that's where Tulum comes into play because you have the Spaniards show up and they crash their ship and the Mayans didn't know what to do with them. And unfortunately, had they killed all the Spaniards or made them leave, then it probably wouldn't have infected them. But because a couple of them had smallpox, they were like, I don't know what to do with them. So they just kind of put them in like their equivalent of like a little jail cell. And they spread their germs to the Mayans. And then next thing they know, like their whole little kingdom's like dying off and they had to evacuate the whole city.
They evacuated it?
Yeah.
Why? Because
they were all dying. They were like, I don't know what the fuck these people brought. These like weird motherfuckers brought us this.
Well, I'm like, I wonder what was the message when they were evacuating the city? Is it like magic? Like evil? Like,
well, you know, but
God's plague?
I'm sure they you know that they understand a little bit of how like disease works. They probably didn't think that these people were like gods.
So, like, it's
because it's not like with the Aztecs where there's this potential for like, oh, was Cortez seen as a god or not? Some people say he was, some people say he wasn't. The Mayans didn't really have anything like that. So I don't think they thought that it was like some retribution by God or that these people were godly. I think if anything, they probably just thought they were like weirdos from some other place. And they just brought their diseases with them.
Get the fuck out.
Probably. But we don't have much information because unfortunately the Spanish arrive and it's probably like a week later they're already starting to get sick and die, and it's probably like a week after that they evacuated the whole city.
It's that fast?
Probably about that fast. And they didn't really have much time to write much down. I mean, we're talking about people that literally carved information into stone. That's how we get most of our information from the Mayans.
Yeah.
You're not really going to sit there and chisel down, currently about to evacuate the city. You know what I mean?
They showed up on horses.
So some of the information we get is from the Spaniards because they didn't kill them. So the Spaniards that didn't die from smallpox because they had like immunity, a lot of them anyway, they just kind of did their thing and they were like, oh, they just evacuated their whole ass city because of us.
Crazy.
Yeah.
It's fucked.
Imagine for them though, they're probably like, well, I guess that works out. We just get to just mosey on back to our ship or whatever.
Oh, remind me if you can. Have you seen I think it's Love, Death and Robots?
Sounds familiar. I haven't seen it.
I think it's in that show in the newest season. There's this really good artistic episode about a Spaniard going through the jungle, but there's like a enchantress spirit in this lake. Yeah. And like if you make eye contact with her or something, like you're toast.
Interesting.
But she's like fighting back for the people in the forest against the Spaniards, like by luring them in with love. And then she takes you into the water and you're gone. Oh. Dude, it's so cool. I'll have to show you that.
Interesting.
You would like it.
Very cool. Yeah.